As a child of the period of the 1930s and 40s, period of the war and the Holocaust and so on, I grew up thinking as I got older that the world is never going to be like this again. I have quite an optimistic view of how things have changed. But as time goes on, as I get older, I find that the world repeats itself, and that many of the things that I had feared are still going on and will continue to go on. And I look ahead and I see a very dangerous and dire world as we look further into the future. And wondering whether you have the same feelings and had the same experience, and whether at this point you too are looking optimistically to the future or pessimistically.
Well, I guess we're about the same age. I grew up in the 30s and 40s too, but and those were a very frightening period. I mean, the rise of fascism over Europe was really frightening. Actually, I can remember the first article I wrote, which was I'll tell you exactly when it was. It was February 1939. It was right after the fall of Barcelona. It was a fourth grade newspaper. I was the editor and the only reader of, I guess. But and it was I kind of remember it. It was about this symbol of Austria falling and Czechoslovakia falling. Now Franco's taking over Spain. You know, what's going to come next? It looked like this monstrous plague was going to spread over the world. Then came the Depression. Was bad enough. Much more serious economic crisis than anything that's happened in the years since. Then comes the war. The Holocaust wasn't really known then. It was known, bits and pieces were known, but it was really only known about later. And then at the end of the war, after all, I mean, you can probably remember August 8th, 1945, when the atom bomb was used. I mean, that struck me as being as terrifying as the rise of fascism over Europe. I mean, that could be the end of the world. It may turn out to be the end of the world, but it was already pretty clear on August 6th, 1945. Even worse, a couple days later when Nagasaki was bombed. Then came many real horrors. I mean, the threats of the Cold War were in fact exaggerated, but they weren't. Something real was exaggerated. And so it goes on. Is it worse now? In some ways, yes. I mean, there are two, maybe three contingencies that might really deal a lethal blow to the survival of the species. One remains nuclear weapons, and that threat is getting worse, unfortunately. Another is environmental catastrophe, and we may be near some kind of tipping point on that. It's not a joke. Another is pandemics. I mean, if there's a bird flu mutation of a kind that could happen, it could lead to a pandemic in which huge numbers of people would die. And very little is being done about any of these things. In fact, in many ways, they're getting worse. So there's reasons for pessimism. On the other hand, there are reasons for optimism, including those we just were talking about. It's a much more civilized society than it was 30 or 40 years ago, in many respects, including those we mentioned. And you can see it in policy as well. I mean, back in the 50s and the 60s, the United States was overthrowing governments at will, imposing brutal, violent, murderous tyrannies. You know, every year there'd be a couple of them. We can't do that anymore. The last time the United States tried to support a military coup to overthrow a democratic government was in 2002 in Venezuela. And it was overturned within a couple of days. For one thing, there was a huge uproar in Latin America about it, most of Latin America, and also because there was a popular uprising, and also because the U.S. couldn't do it openly, you know, the way it was done in the past, because there's too much opposition here. Well, those are reasons. Things like that are reasons for optimism. So you take a choice. I mean, you can be pessimistic if you like, bewail imagine golden days of the past or look at the things that are positive and try to amplify them.